I saw the email at 6:47 on a Tuesday evening. The kind of gray November evening Toronto specializes in, when the sky hangs low over the financial district and the CN Tower disappears into the mist like it was never there at all. I was still at the office, the 28th floor of the building on Bay Street, finishing a term sheet for a private equity client. My husband's phone was face up on the corner of my desk, plugged into my charger because he'd forgotten his at home again. The preview flashed across the screen and I read it before I could decide not to. Booked the Fairmont for the weekend of the 14th. Got us the lake view suite this time. Can't wait to see you in nothing but that bracelet. The sender was someone saved in his phone as Morrison, Jenna Deloitte. The 14th of November was my 40th birthday. The Fairmont Royal York was where my husband had proposed to me 14 years earlier, on the 32nd floor, with a ring he'd saved 2 years of junior associate salary to buy. The bracelet he was referring to, I assumed, was the Burke's piece he had given her, not the one he had given me. He had never been original. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even feel the thing I had always assumed I would feel in a moment like this. The sharp-edged grief that wives in films collapse under. Instead, I felt something quieter and more useful. I felt awake. For the first time in what might have been years, I felt entirely, completely awake. I put his phone back down exactly where I had found it, angled at the same degree, charger cable draped in the same loose loop. I finished the term sheet. I sent it to my paralegal with the usual note. I walked down to the parking garage on Wellington Street, got into my Audi, and drove home to our house in Rosedale with the radio tuned to CBC, listening to a panel discussion about agricultural subsidies in Saskatchewan. I made him dinner. Herb-crusted rack of lamb. Because he had mentioned the night before that he'd been craving it. I poured him a glass of the Niagara Cabernet he liked. I asked him about his day. He told me about a difficult client file. He told me he was going to be traveling the weekend of my birthday, a last-minute thing, a deal in Montreal that had suddenly become urgent. He was so sorry. He would make it up to me. Maybe we could go to Prince Edward County the weekend after, stay at that inn we liked, the one with the cheese farm nearby. He looked at me with the soft, rehearsed apology of a man who has already been forgiven in his own mind. I said of course. I said I understood. I said work was work. I had practiced that face for a long time, it turned out. I just hadn't known I was practicing. My name, for the purposes of this story, does not matter. What matters is who I had been and who I was about to become. I had grown up in Halifax, the daughter of a Dalhousie law professor and a woman who ran a small literary magazine out of her dining room. I had gone to McGill, then to Osgoode, then to a firm on Bay Street where I made partner at 32, the youngest woman in the firm's history to do so. I specialized in mergers and acquisitions. I was the one in the room who read every footnote and remembered which subsidiary had been spun off in 2009 and under what terms. My colleagues used to joke that I had a filing cabinet where other people had feelings. My husband, whom I will call by the role he occupied in my life, was a senior partner at the same firm. We had met as associates. He had been charming then, ambitious in a loud way that complemented my quiet one. When we started dating, people said we were the couple who would run the firm one day. When we married, my father gave a toast in which he quoted Margaret Atwood, something about a word after a word after a word being power. And my husband had laughed and said he hoped the word was partnership. That had been the word, for a long time. And then, slowly, it had stopped being the word. It happens the way my grandmother used to say ice comes to a lake. Not all at once. Not with a crack. You go to bed one night and the surface is still moving, and you wake up the next morning and something has frozen underneath without you noticing. Then another morning. Then another. And one day you realize you can walk across a thing that used to be water. The freezing had started, I could see now, about 3 years earlier. A new associate had joined the firm. She was 28, blonde in the expensive way, a graduate of the University of Toronto Law Program with an MBA from Rotman. Her name was Jenna Morrison. My husband had been assigned to mentor her. He had mentioned her at dinner the way a man mentions a new colleague, which is to say, he had mentioned her too casually, too often, and never quite by name. The new associate, the Rotman girl. You know, the one on the pharmaceutical file. 2 years earlier, he had suggested I take a step back from the Toronto Stock Exchange file I had been leading. The client was getting demanding, he said. I had a lot on my plate. He could take point. I had agreed, because that was what partners did for each other. That file had been worth $17 million in fees over the following 18 months. My name had come off the matter memo sometime in the spring. I had not noticed until the Christmas bonus distribution, when my share of the file revenue had been recategorized as administrative support. 1 year earlier, the managing partner committee had changed its meeting time to 7 in the morning on Fridays. My husband had said it was because the chair, a man in his 60s, preferred early mornings. I had a daughter in grade 9 at Havergal who needed driving to school. I had been the one, I could see now, who was supposed to have trouble with 7 a.m. on Fridays. I had started missing meetings. My opinions had started being summarized, secondhand, by my husband, to a room I was no longer in. 6 months earlier, a motion had passed reassigning my corner office on the 28th floor, the one facing the lake, to a newly promoted partner. I had been moved to a smaller office on the 27th floor, facing the back of the Scotiabank Tower. My husband had told me the move was a sign of solidarity. We're redistributing space. Everyone's giving up something. He had kept his office. 3 months earlier, at a firm retreat at a lodge in Muskoka, I had walked into a glass-walled meeting room where he and Jenna Morrison were sitting across from each other, laughing at something on her phone. They had stopped laughing when they saw me. She had stood up too quickly and knocked over her coffee. He had said, "Morning, sweetheart, Jenna's just showing me a meme her brother sent her." I had nodded and walked out. I had told myself I was being paranoid. I had told myself I trusted him. I had told myself a lot of things. And now, on a Tuesday night in early November, with a rack of lamb cooling on a plate between us, I knew that all of those things had been lies. And I knew, with the same clarity with which I read a contract, that I had been the one lying them to myself, because the alternative was to look straight at what my marriage had become. I did not look away anymore. The next morning I got to the office at 6. I went to my old assistant, a woman named Margaret who had worked with me for 11 years and who had been quietly moved to the floor below when I was. I closed her office door. I told her I needed her to do 3 things for me, and I needed her to do them without mentioning them to anyone, including my husband, especially my husband. She did not ask why. She just nodded once, the way she had nodded once in 2014 when I had asked her to help me pack up a dying client's office and send the family his photographs. The first thing I asked her to do was pull every file my husband had touched in the last 18 months that involved client trust accounts. The second thing was to quietly request the firm's expense reports for the same period, filtered for any entries related to the Fairmont Royal York, the Langdon Hall property in Cambridge, and a boutique hotel in Montreal called the Mount Stephen. The third thing was to get me a meeting, off calendar, with a woman named Evelyn Cheung, who sat on our firm's management committee and who had, at the Christmas party the year before, told me that if I ever needed to talk, I should call her. She had said it while looking at my husband across the room. By Friday I had what I needed. The expense reports were damning in a quiet, cumulative way. 11 weekends in the last 14 months, booked at hotels on the firm's corporate card, under the file number of a real estate trust whose principals had, I confirmed by a single phone call, never stayed at any of those hotels in their lives. The bookings had been expensed back to the client without the client's knowledge. This was not an affair. This was fraud, and not a small one. By my calculation, he had billed somewhere in the range of $84,000 of personal travel to clients who were unaware they were paying for it. The trust account files were worse. There was a pattern of small, carefully structured transfers out of a particular client's estate account, a widow in Oakville whose husband's estate my husband had been administering for the last 2 years. The transfers went to a numbered Ontario corporation, which I was able, with one more phone call to a friend at the corporate registry, to trace to a property management company owned jointly by my husband and Jenna Morrison. The property it managed was a condominium in Yorkville that I had never heard of. They had bought it 8 months earlier. I understood now where he had been on the evenings he was at the gym. I sat in my small office on the 27th floor on the Friday afternoon, looking at what I had, and I understood the shape of what was being done to me. My husband had been, for at least 2 years, quietly building the case for pushing me out of the firm. Not divorcing me, not yet. First taking my files, then my office, then my standing on the committees. Eventually, I assumed, there would be a motion, presented in a reasonable tone, about whether my contributions justified my compensation. He would vote. Jenna would not. because she was too junior, but the senior partners he had been cultivating for 3 years would. I would be offered a soft landing, probably a counsel role at reduced pay, probably at a branch office. I would, being me, be too professional to fight it publicly. I would take the package, I would leave. And then, 18 months or 2 years after that, he would file for divorce, having first moved the matrimonial assets into structures I could no longer see. He had almost done it. He had been, I realized with a cold kind of admiration, close to finished. If I had not seen that text message on my desk on Tuesday, I might have continued to sleepwalk through the last act of my own erasure, signing the papers he handed me, taking the office he suggested, accepting the explanations he offered. But I had seen it. And I was, by training and by temperament, a woman who knew how to read the end of a contract before she signed the first page. I met with Evelyn Cheung on Friday at 5, in a quiet corner of the members' dining room at the National Club. I did not cry. I did not ask for sympathy. I laid out the expense reports, the trust account records, the numbered company registration, and the condominium title. I told her I wanted the firm to know, through the proper channels, and I wanted the matter handled according to the firm's own ethics policy, and the law societies, and the criminal code. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she closed the folder and looked at me for a long moment over her glasses. Then she said, "How much time do you need before we act?" I said, 1 week. I have a birthday this weekend. I'd like to enjoy it. She almost smiled. She said, "Happy early birthday." On Saturday morning, I kissed my husband goodbye at the door of our house in Rosedale. He was wheeling a weekend bag toward his car. He told me he hated that he was going to miss my birthday. He told me he had left a card on the kitchen island and that there was a reservation at Aloe on Wednesday when he got back, just the two of us, and he had something special he wanted to give me. He kissed me on the forehead. He said he loved me. I said I loved him too. Both of those sentences, I realized as the door closed behind him, were true in exactly the way lies are true. They had been true once. They were not true now. Saying them was a kind of archaeology. I watched his car turn out of our driveway, and I went upstairs and I changed into the dress I had bought 3 days earlier at Holt Renfrew, a long dark green silk thing that my mother would have called severe and meant as a compliment. I put on the earrings my grandmother had left me. I did not put on the bracelet my husband had given me on our 10th anniversary. I put on a different one. It was the one I had bought for myself the Monday after I had made partner, a thin gold cuff from Burke's, the one piece of jewelry I had ever chosen alone. I drove downtown. I parked at the Fairmont Royal York. I walked through the lobby, past the clock where my husband had proposed to me 14 years earlier, past the bar where we had celebrated, and I rode the elevator to the 29th floor. I had booked the room adjacent to his. Same floor. Same view. I had booked it under my maiden name, which I had never formally changed, and which I suspected he had forgotten I still legally possessed. At 6 in the evening, I opened the door of my suite to my guest. His name was Richard Delacroix. He was 61 years old. He was a senior partner at the largest competing firm in Toronto, a man my husband had spent the better part of a decade trying to poach clients from and failing. He was also, as it happened, the chair of the Ethics Committee of the Law Society of Ontario for the current term. He had been my mentor at Osgood. He had written the recommendation letter that got me hired at my firm. He had been, for 15 years, the one person in the profession whose opinion my husband actively feared. I had called him on Thursday. I had told him I needed 40 minutes of his time on Saturday evening. I had said I had documents to show him. Documents I needed a witness for. He had said, "Where?" I had said, "The Fairmont. Room 2904. He had been quiet for a beat. Then he had said, "I'll be there at 6. He arrived precisely on time, in a charcoal suit and a tie I recognized from the cover of a Canadian lawyer magazine profile. He accepted a glass of champagne. He sat at the small desk by the window, looking out at the lake, and he read the documents I had brought with me, the same ones I had shown Evelyn Cheung, plus one more thing, a memorandum I had drafted that morning, laying out my intentions. He read for 40 minutes. He asked 3 questions. I answered them. He signed, as a witness, the affidavit I had prepared. At 7 o'clock, I heard the elevator chime in the hallway. I heard 2 voices, his and hers, his low and familiar, hers bright with the kind of laughter a woman performs when she is 28 and believes she is winning. I heard them stop outside the door of the suite next to mine, 2906, the Lakeview suite, the one where, 14 years earlier, I had said yes. I heard a key card click. I heard the door open and close. Richard looked at me across the small table. He raised his glass slightly and said nothing. I did not go next door. I did not bang on their wall. I did not do any of the things a woman in a film would do. I sat with my old mentor, and I drank my champagne, and I watched the lake turn slate gray in the November dusk. And I felt, for the first time in I could not remember how long, that I was sitting inside my own life instead of outside of it. At 9, Richard left. He said, "I'll see you Monday." I said, "Yes, you will." I stayed in my suite until 10. Then I walked down the hall, past their door, not looking at it, and I took the elevator down, and I drove home to Rosedale, and I slept in our bed alone, and I slept deeply, the way I had not slept in 3 years. Monday morning at 9, our firm's management committee convened its regular weekly meeting on the 29th floor of our building. My husband was there, in the gray suit he had come home in on Sunday evening, looking tanned in a way that had nothing to do with November. Jenna Morrison was not at the meeting, being too junior. But she was at her desk on the 26th floor, where she had, I assumed, begun the week feeling that things were going her way. The meeting opened with an unexpected item. Evelyn Chung stood up. She said, "Before we begin the scheduled agenda, the management committee has received an ethics complaint that requires our immediate attention. The complaint was filed Friday afternoon. It is accompanied by documentary evidence that has been reviewed by outside counsel." She paused. The outside counsel is Richard Delacroix. I watched my husband's face. He had the look of a man who is trying to remember whether he turned the stove off, and then, as the seconds passed, the look of a man who has realized he did not. Evelyn read the complaint aloud. She read the expense reports. She read the trust account reconciliations. She read the numbered company documents. She read the condominium title. When she got to the condominium title, I watched my husband close his eyes, just once, very slowly, the way a man closes his eyes when he is measuring how far he has fallen and how much farther he has left to go. I did not speak. I did not need to. I had written the complaint in the calm, passive voice I had been taught to use at Osgood, the voice of a document that describes a catastrophe as though it were a weather pattern. It was more damning than any outburst I could have offered. The committee voted, unanimously, to refer the matter to the Law Society and to suspend my husband from partnership effective immediately, pending the outcome of the disciplinary proceeding. He left the room without looking at me. Jenna Morrison was asked to collect her belongings and leave the building by the end of the day. The firm's general counsel would be in touch with her regarding her own potential exposure, which, given the condominium title, was not negligible. In the months that followed, the story played out in the careful, bureaucratic way these stories play out in Canada, without drama, without tabloid photographs, in the quiet columns of the Law Times and the disciplinary notices of the Law Society. My husband surrendered his license rather than face a full hearing. He pleaded guilty, in the Ontario Court of Justice, to 2 counts of fraud over $5,000 and 1 count of breach of trust. He received a sentence of 32 months in a federal institution. Jenna Morrison, whose role in the scheme was smaller but not nothing, received a suspended sentence and was disbarred. The condominium in Yorkville was sold under court order. The widow in Oakville was made whole, with interest, out of my husband's share of our matrimonial assets. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday in January. The proceedings were straightforward. I had been careful, long before Tuesday in November, about how our assets were held. I kept the house in Rosedale. I kept our daughter, who had, at 15, understood more than I had realized and who, when I finally told her the truth in full, had simply said, "I know, Mom. I've known for a while. I didn't know how to say it to you." That was the only moment in the entire affair when I cried. I did not return to the firm. I resigned my partnership in February and opened my own practice in March, on the 18th floor of a smaller building on University Avenue. I took 6 clients with me, the ones who had been mine to begin with, the ones whose names had been quietly removed from my matter memos 2 years earlier. Margaret came with me. So did 3 associates who, I discovered, had been waiting for an excuse. Richard Delacroix sent me a note the day we opened. It said only, About time. My daughter is in grade 11 now. She wants to go to McGill, like I did. We drive up to Halifax in the summers, to see my mother, who is 79 and still runs her literary magazine out of her dining room. We walk along the boardwalk at Point Pleasant Park and she tells me about books I should read, and I tell her, sometimes, about things I should have read earlier, in my own life, and did not. I do not think often about the man I was married to. When I do, I think about the morning at the Muskoka retreat, 3 months before I saw the text message, when I walked into that glass-walled room and saw them laughing, and told myself I was being paranoid. I think about how long I had been teaching myself not to see what was in front of me. I think about how the worst thing he did was not the affair, and not the fraud, and not the condominium in Yorkville. The worst thing he did was spend 3 years convincing me, carefully, patiently, almost tenderly, that I was imagining the shape of my own erasure. And I think about the Saturday at the Fairmont, and the slate-gray lake, and the sound of a keycard clicking in the door of the next room over, and the taste of champagne that I had poured for myself, in my own dress, in a room I had booked in my own name. That is the moment, if I had to choose one, that I would keep. Not because it was revenge. It was not revenge. Revenge is loud, and it wants an audience, and I have never, in my entire life, wanted an audience. It was, instead, the moment I stopped being furniture in someone else's story, and remembered that I was the one who had read the contract first. He is out of prison now. I believe he lives in Burlington. I have not seen him, and I do not intend to. My daughter sees him twice a year, on her terms, at a restaurant of her choosing, and she tells me afterward how it went, and I listen, and I do not ask questions I do not need the answers to. The life I am living now is quieter than the one I lived before. It is also mine. Every piece of it, down to the gold cuff on my wrist, is something I chose, and no one has the standing to move it without my permission. That, in the end, is the only ending that mattered.